Hello, namaskar everyone. Wait, boy, am I audible? Wait, let me just check if my voice is okay. Okay, audio is fine. So today we will continue from last day. Let me just give a quick recap. So yesterday or the last day we read about upper caste Muslims and upper strata of Muslims, how they were forming their own political agenda, and how everything is connected to their the globalized civilizational kind of thing that it is not merely bounded by boundaries or anything. Then we also understand what is state, what is culture by definition. Then we started the interaction of state and culture, especially its instances in Europe. Now today we will continue the interaction of state and culture in India. So before we continue, let me remind you that this is from the book. We are reading a book, The Seedbed of Pakistan, which is written by Sir Saumya Dey. He's an excellent scholar and an independent researcher. So please buy his book, support him. You can get his book in Amazon, Mega India, and any platform. So please do buy it, and it doesn't cost too much. So yeah, support, sir. Okay, let us continue reading. Over there. Yes. So we left it last day here. We will continue from here. Coming to India, one of the ways in which state and culture interacted here was through the king's role as the sustainer of dharma. As a concept, dharma is remarkably supple. However, let us give it the working definition of a cultural matrix that compromises social, moral, and political norms along with the spiritual outlook. Okay, so however, please remember this. Let us give it the working definition of a cultural matrix that compromise social, moral, and political norms along with the spiritual outlook. Please do remember it. The social norms that emanated from dharma pertain to the four varnas. One could term the varna. Uh, uh, One could term the varna order as semiotic complex, since each of the four varnas symbolize or meant archetypical social or economic function. The ancient Indian state, in its cultural role, was meant to be a sustainer of this semiotic complex. Thus, an epithet of the king in Sanskrit is Dharma Pravartaka, that is, one who upholds the Varna-based social order. The king did not just protect its subjects, Praja, from external danger, but also maintain the internal structure of society by upholding Varnashrama Dharma. If required, the king was meant to deploy danda or coercive power wielded in the form of the army to discharge this role and extend the limits of the state. For example, danda was used to establish the ordering of society in which caste as a theory of stratification became one of the mechanisms by which the state was made acceptable in areas where no state had existed earlier. Along with the Brahminical, the king as a preserver of dharma was an ideal in the Buddhist tradition as well. We see Buddhist texts using sobriquets such as Dharmadhvaja, Dharmaketu, and Dharmadhipati to denote the ruler. The rulers too, for their part, stressed their role as the preserver of dharma in its social aspect. Epigraphic evidence dating to the early centuries of the Christian era establishes that Dharmaraja was used as a proper name by several kings. Subsequently, royal epithets praising the defense of the Varna order appear in inscriptions in the second century and then become common. As a matter of fact, ancient Indian political thought located the origin and necessity of the state or a designated ruling class with coercive power in the preservation of a society organized with honor, with their apportioned social roles. According to about half a dozen Puranas, writes Haris Sharma, Brahma prescribed coercion done as the profession of the Kshatriya so that the Varnas performed their respective duties. Besides, the Varna order, preserving and patronizing dharma in the form of its spiritual outlook and its semiotic expressions, commonly termed religion, was an important source of legitimacy for the ancient Indian polity. We see the Arthashastra of Kautilya prescribing how religious considerations ought to guide royal behavior in various situations. The text directs the king to respect the religious sentiments and practices of the conquered peoples. It was also meant to grant their priests several immunities as per the tenets of Brahmanical society. The Arthashastra also provides for the state patronage of several deities and their worship, especially enjoining the king to reserve the north of the city for its titular deity, Nagardevat. Another suggestion that the Arthashastra makes is for the principal gates of the capital to be named after deities such as Brahma, Indra, Yama, etc. And for places of worship and pilgrimages to be constructed within its limits. In later post-Mauryan India, we find the Kushanas making an unambiguous declaration of the religion they profess. For example, the Kushana ruler Cadphises, or I guess that's the I termed himself Dharma, Dharmati Dasa, probably an account on account of his devotion to the Dharma of the Buddha. Bhagwan Shiva, who was represented in the Kushana coin, ancient Indian state and the ruler thus projected a cultural intent through visible identification with a range of evocative, conspicuous, conspicuous and potent symbols, which the Varna order, sacred architecture, pilgrimages, and deities were. Moving on, the cultural persona of the ancient Indian state had a linguistic aspect to it in the form of Sanskrit. Selden Polo writes that the Sanskrit language forms a way of speaking about and conceiving of the nature of political power. In an enormous cosmopolis that encompassed the whole of the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia, its development occurred as there emerged by the 5th century CE a linguistically homogeneous and conceptually standardized form of Sanskrit political poetry. This political poetry was of two kinds, Kavya and Prasasti, published as inscriptions and used to announce the glorious deeds, victories, valor, and virtues of rulers through this verse form. Sanskrit became a standard way of communicating political will and a means to the aestheticization of power. In the cosmopolis in which it obtained, one reason behind this, according to Polo, was Sanskrit's remarkable communicative capacity. Due to the formal and rhetorical attributes that it possessed, Sanskrit could make a reality in a way more real by rendering it more noticeable, more complex, more beautiful. Sanskrit, in other words, was very good at enriching reality, very likely because of its capacity to generate meanings out of it. Consequent to this, Sanskrit was considered a very appropriate vessel for the expression of royal will, and it came to be expected of kings to acquire felicity in the language. In other words, Sanskrit in ancient India was a remarkably evocative symbol of cultural power, and royal authority was meant to know how to wield it. We do indeed find rulers in ancient Indian history who used the Sanskrit language with great dexterity. For instance, some of the Gupta kings were Sanskrit poets of no mean order. That is, they were quite competent at composing verses in Sanskrit. It is probable that besides being connoisseurs and practitioners of Sanskrit literature, the Gupta kings also sought to invest their persons with a certain divinity. This is evidenced in the Raghuvamsham, allegedly a Gupta era text that identifies the ruler with the deity. Moving down a few centuries, we see that identification with cultural symbols such as signs and deities was often vital to the formation and functioning of states. In early medieval India, this was indeed so in South India in a big way. For example, James Hetzman writes about the Chola state, that is that is the Chola state that it displayed characteristics of the ritual segmental state. That is, the Chola kings sought to enact disparate and autonomous local leaders under a single mediating agency through ritual means. These involved granting royal protection to religious institutions by making them tax-free grants and constructing shrines, and arbitrating local disputes typically involving religious institutions. The Cholas thus represented a style of dharmic kingship. The king, as it seems, to project authority upon disparate local chiefs, and unite the realm by intervening in the administration of religious institutions. Temples. In this sense, temples were enablers of kingly power in early medieval India. Alongside, temples came to play together very important roles in the early medieval polities. Being a symbol in material space of the sacred domain, the temple could be an instrument for the king to temporarily approximate that domain by identifying with the deity enshrined. This practice was began. This practice was begun by the Pallavas and augmented by the Cholas. Or the king could rule as the agent of the deity placed in the temple, apparently in search of greater authority and legitimacy. The Gajapati king, the Gajapati king Anangavima, uh, the Gajapati king Anangavima, 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 the Gajapati king Anangavima, see, for example, did the same by surrendering his temporal powers to Bhagwan Jagannath. When a ruler sought to establish an imperial reign, he again did so vassal, uh, by putting himself in vassalage to a deity. For instance, as an imperial lord or Maharaja Viraja, he would style himself the earthly representative of the tutelary deity, Rashtradevat of the kingdom, usually Bhagwan Shiva or Vishnu. The tutelary deity was fitted out with the symbol of an earthly Maharaj, and the temple rites were assimilated into the palace rites. It has been argued that the construction of several large monumental temples, such as Raja Rajeshwara and Lingaraja, as regional kingdoms attained the height of their power between 1000 and 2030 CE, testifies to the process of titular deities being assigned a political role. The political or temporal role of the titular deity of a state was taken very seriously indeed. In 1354, Bukka, one of the founders of the Vijayanagara kingdom, made Virupaksha a form of Bhagwan Shiva that stated. So devoted were Vijayanagara rulers to Virupaksha that important state documents bore his signature. Richard Eaton suggests that the Vijayanagara state was imagined as a unique sacred space on account of its association with Virupaksha. Along with the shrine of Virupaksha, the Vijayanagara king supported the Ramachandra temple, which probably served as the state chapel and the focal point of a spatially articulated political theology, and identified the ruler with Sri Rama. Again, the annual Vijayadashami festival was very important for the Vijayanagara kings. On this occasion, they honored worthy Brahmins, the astrologer, and the Purohita, and held sports of elephants, horses, and foot soldiers. Through this grand display, the Vijayanagara kings incorporated the disparate elements of the kingdom into their sovereignty, rendering them all gods, metonyms of themselves. The power of the Vijayanagara sovereign was thus culturally uh, amplified and communicated across the realm through some spectacular symbolic displays. Based on what we observed, the European and Indian situation, it suggests that states may be termed culture power formation. As we see, the modern linguistic nation state primarily wields language, while the pre-modern state mainly utilized religion. To fulfill the expediencies of rule, For power enforcement, states thus represent specific alliances of culture and power. Culture buttresses and provides pathways to state power. Or one might say that culture in the hands of the state is the capillary force of the power embodied by state power. On the other hand, undergirds culture. This symbiosis of state and culture, as you see, is because both seek to regulate and order human behavior. They both, to borrow some Foucauldian phrases, are modes of action upon human actions, or forms of conduct upon conduct, or conduct among conduct. State and culture, in this sense, one might say, share a certain essence. Now, as we put the idea of what state and culture and uh, how state and culture is in interaction in Europe, in sense of in Europe and some examples are instances of India. Now we will dive into the book's main content, that is the Islamic State, that is the Mughal elite and its anxieties. Just give me a minute before. Yeah, understanding the Islamic State. Let us make it clear that we are not using the term narrowly to merely denote Muslim religious beliefs, practices, and theology. Though the Islamic State will surely include this. The term was originally coined by Marshall Option, the author of Grand Three Volume History of Islam. He understood the Islamic State as a culture centered on a later tradition, which has been historically distinctive of Islamdom, the society, and which has been naturally shared in by both Muslims and non-Muslims who participated at all fully in the society of Islamdom. Simply put, Option primarily saw the Islamic State as a literary or literate tradition, historically characteristic of a Muslim society, but which could potentially include non-Muslims in its fold. Like us, it did not take a narrowly religious view of Islam. The term would be explained or referred to the social and cultural Muslims. Oh, Muslims, even when found among non-Muslims, as a social and cultural complex, the Islamic State could express itself through a language such as being the purveyor of rich later tradition, it always involved very fair numbers of non-Muslims. After all, one of the most well-known Urdu literatures in Urdu literature in is Munsif Premchand, a Hindu. If one could not refer to it, Urdu, as Islamic rights option, one could say it was a language of the culture of Islam. Now, this is crucial since, as it seems to us, option means that the Islamic is the same as the culture of Islam. In that case, along with Urdu, it is possible to identify so many other instances or components of the Islamic. Persian language and literary forms, Islamic architecture, the poetry practices and ceremonials of Muslim ruled states, the conceptions of sovereignty and legitimate kingship sought to be developed with reference to Islam. Islamic jurisprudence, theology, and devotion. Muslim attitudes towards non-Muslims and their religious beliefs and a rather heterodox mode of spirituality, such as Buddhism, just to name a few. The Islamic themes may be understood as so many artifacts, traditions, practice, ideas, and forms of behavior broadly associable with Muslims, all of them deployable as powerful and evocative symbols. Islamic does is the cultural metrics rooted in the social body of Islam. The Islamic cultural matrix might find some participation rules for accommodation for non-Muslims, but only it seems as subordinate for or marginal partners, as the historical survey might suggest. Example, Islamic jurisprudence and conceptions of sovereignty could accommodate non-Muslims only as they mean. Muslim attitude towards non-Muslim religiosity have been mostly ambivalent, even hostile. And Islamic literary cultures, be it Persian or Urdu, only touched the elite fringe of non-Muslim societies. Among Hindus, they involved mostly Kayasthas, Khatris, and Kashmiri Pandits. Now, the symbolic ways of the Islamic state, so, as we understood, symbolic state in Europe and India. So, basically, in Europe, as was the King James Bible, which Protestantism, then church and etc. etc. And in India, like we gave it outlook of such, like the temple, the deity, etc. Now, how the Islamic, uh, how the Islamic named its symbol or established its symbol, the symbolic ways of Islam. An Arab army led by Muhammad bin Qasim marched into and conquered Persia early in 712 CE. A nearly 3 century long interlude followed before India had a second significant encounter with Muslim. It was in 1000 CE when Mahmud of Ghazni, ruler of a small principality in Afghanistan, commenced the first of his what eventually became yearly military forays into India. It was during one of them that in 1025 CE, he ventured all the way to Somnath on Gujarat's southern coast and sacked and destroyed the famous Shiva temple. He died in 1030 CE. He repeatedly raided and pillaged North India and incorporated Punjab and parts of Sindh into his dominion. Ghaznavid rule in India turned out to be relatively short-lived. Though. It ended in 1186 when Mahmud Ghuri took Lahore from the Ghaznavid. In 1192, he defeated Prithviraj Chauhan in the Battle of Tarai after being bested by him the previous year at the same place. Later, his slave Qutub-al-Din Aibak conquered Delhi, the Chauhan capital, laid the foundations of the Delhi Sultanate. Aibak became its ruler 12, 1206 after his master was assassinated in 1206 and inaugurated what is called the Mamluk or slave dynasty, followed by the Khalji, Tughlaq, Sayyid, and Lodi dynasties. This was a historical moment when we say the Islamic state form, a distinct culture power formation, was truly planted in India. The new state transformed Delhi's sacred spaces as Aibak constructed the Fatul Islam was at Mirapur, alternatively Mihirapalli, currently known as Mehroli, using the masonry of 27 pre-existing Hindu and Jain temples. Unlike the ancient and early medieval Indian state, the Delhi Sultanate was not a patron and preserver of the science of deity. Though we learned that Aibak's master, Muhammad Ghuri, had issued coins bearing the image of Devi Lakshmi. As a matter of fact, it appears to be a pattern that the annexation of new territory to the Delhi Sultanate was followed by the destruction of temples. When Qutb bin Mubarak Khalji, 1316 20 to 20, defeated the Yadava dynasty in 1918, he constructed a grand congregational mosque in their capital, Devagiri, stripping 177 columns from Hindu and Jain temples nearby. According to Richard Eaton, the Grand Mosque at Devagiri projected Delhi's political presence in this distant province. Not long after Qutb Prince Ulugh Khan, son of Sultan Ghiyath bin Tughlaq, 1320 to 25, sought to project Delhi's political presence into another distant territory the same way. He captured Warangal, the Kakatiya capital in the Telugu heartland, and destroyed the great temple of Swayambhu Shiva that it was known for. Dismantled the structure to its foundations and used its masonry to construct a large congregational mosque. The Delhi Sultanate reduced, restricted, the public cultural displays of its non-Muslim subjects by violating the sacred spaces or shrines. Further, it continued to broadcast its authority through monumental mosques. We identify these as instances of semiotic oh, deployed in the Indian context. Indian image of a triumphant Islam. Triumphant Islam. Little digression before we move on. Richard Eaton claims that attacking a temple patronized by an enemy king had been integrated into Indian political behavior since the 6th century CE. Very important. Seemingly, he is arguing that we ought to see the foregoing instances of temple destruction as a continuation of an age-old practice resorted to by Hindu rulers. But should we? Meenakshi Jain compellingly argues that we should not. What Hindu rulers carried out the rites when they attacked a temple in an enemy kingdom was image appropriation. That is, they carried away the Vigraha and installed it in a grand temple of their own. For example, she points out Yashovarman, the Chandela ruler, 1925 to 50 CE, seized an image of Vaikuntha Vishnu from the Pratihara ruler, Devapala, and installed it in the Lakshmana Vaikuntha temple at Hajura, while several Chalukya and Kalinga icons were placed in the Gangai Konda Cholapuram temple complex built by Rajendra Chola I, 1014 to 1044. These icons were likely to have been destroyed during military campaigns. Muslim rulers, on the other hand, were said to have destroyed entire temples and where that was not possible, disfigured the image. Further, we have seen above that not just Hindu but Jain temples which were unlikely to have been built and patronized by their dynasty, too were destroyed in Delhi and Devagiri. Hence, we are inclined to think that the iconoclasm practiced by the Delhi Sultanate uniquely belonged to an Islamic and cultural discourse of power. Very, very important. And since you have the references here, and maybe we'll cut this part like a clip, make it a clip, and put it as a video. That debunking of that Hindu kings or Hindu rulers also used to destroy temples after having over another kingdom, one to another kingdom. But that is simply not true. As you can see here, Meenakshi Jainji has debunked it very amazingly. Let's move on. Moving on, an individual ruler of the Delhi Sultanate would place his actions within a paradigm of Islamic symbolism. This is Islamic symbolism, by the way. Destroying temples, stripping them, then building a mosque. Islamic symbolism or cultural ideals. Apparently, to lend his authority greater salience and validity, Shams al-Din into Iltutmish, 1211 to 1236. For example, he instituted a full-fledged department with qazis, muftis, and Sheikh al-Islam to deal with religious matters. He built mosques and madrasas to strengthen the foundations of his rule. Iltutmish was close to the ulama too, writes Sunil Kumar, since he shared their concerns regarding the imposition of the Sharia in his domains. He used the Sharia as a justification for charging jizya, and also destroyed some old temples on the ground that they were peculiarly Muslims. Apparently, he sought to pose as a sultan who performed the dual role of conqueror and protector of the holy law, Sharia. Reportedly, he also ruled the fact that Muslims, or sorry, I think it would be wrong, but also ruled the fact that Muslims, in terms of strength, were still like salt in a dish, and thus unable to wage all-out war, either to force infidels to accept Islam or to exterminate them because of their refusal. Cultural portion of the state in rule made such posturing necessary. In Islam, writes S. Nurul Hasan, provided a powerful binding force for the ruling classes. The Sultan had to take some demonstrative steps to show to his co-religionists that he was ruling in accordance with the laws of Islam. He does not seem to have had much of a choice in this regard, as according to Raziuddin Akili, there was a general perception among Muslims in the Delhi Sultanate that it was their government. Sometimes the textual discourse of power in the Foucauldian sense of being a totality of effective statement prevailing in the Delhi Sultanate appears to have been developed with reference to a cultural imagination of what a correct Muslim ruler ought to do. For example, Zia al-Din Barani, 1285, author of Fatwa-e Jahandari and courtier and companion of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, 1324 to 51, declared that a good Muslim king should not be content with merely levying the jizya and haraj on Hindus. Marani preferred that he should instead go to the extent of establishing the supreme position of Islam by overthrowing infidelity, Hinduism, and slaughtering its leaders, Brahmins, the Brahmanas. Varani seems to have been quite a pious man, and Muzaffar Alam, one of the most well-known historians of medieval India, writes that in his world there could only be two life patterns diametrically opposed to each other, one in conformity with the Sharia and the other against it. Varani's prophet, Alam further writes, even the normal universal human qualities into binary opposition, Islamic and anti-Islamic, or Sari and Islamic or Sari and Ghair Sari basically. As far as Barani was concerned, the or secular state regulations were valid only as far as they were expedient measures undertaken in situations in which Muslim rulers were unable to implement the regulations of the Sharia in full. His acute concern for the Sharia actually made his attitude towards temporal authority somewhat ambivalent. Barani thought that the institution of the Sultanate had no place in Sharia and it restricted its operation. However, he still regarded the Sultanate necessary for the survival of the Sharia. While it intervened in the violated the sacred spaces of the non-Muslims, the Delhi Sultanate closely associated itself with the spiritual charisma of Muslim holy men or the Sufis. Eaton informs us that in every provincial center of the Sultanate, there resided a Sufi sheikh who belonged to one or another spiritual order of Sufis. There were not lone they were not lone strangers distributing spiritual merit, but very much connected to metropolitan Delhi. It seems like a network of Sufis spanned out from Delhi early, replicating the administrative network of the Delhi Sultanate and to overlap. Eaton writes that prominent Sufis of Delhi sent out their leading disciples to the provincial centers who were then patronized by the governor posted there. The Sultan sought proximity to the Sufis. Ghiasuddin Balban, 1266 to 87, for example, was a devotee of Fariduddin Ganjai in Sakar. The Lodi Sultans dined in the company of the Sufis. The Sufis, on the other hand, often subserved the Sultan's interests. They would participate in military campaigns and even give suggestions as to how they might be prosecuted successfully. As you can see, how the Sufis are like they are not only the major Catholics, like they are the brains behind uh, all those mass killings and what should I say? You all know the word genocide, genocide. This, these were like very very evil, and we're not. They are very evil. We exist today, and we all know how Bollywood and there's a whole this pop media and Bollywood try to whitewash them and present them as such peaceful, loving, uh, music, musical bands. Persian flourished in the Delhi Sultanate. Aziz Ahmad tells us that Delhi became the principal center of Persian poetry in the 13th century and retained this position till the 18th. Persian language versifiers such as Tajuddin Sangriza and Sivavati Mahamara found patronage at the court of Iltutmish. Amir Khusrau, here comes the famous Sufi. I hope every one of you have definitely heard of Amir Khusrau till now. Amir Khusrau, the most famous Indian poet in the Persian language, who lived in Delhi as a disciple of the Sufi sage Nizam al-Din Aulia. Persian language historiography too found a favorable atmosphere in the Delhi Sultanate. To give a few examples of the most famous historians, to give a few examples of the most famous historians and the histories that one associates with them, there is Minhaj al-Siraj, Minhaj al-Siraj, al-Jani, his Tabakati Nasiri, a work dealing with the Ghurids and early Mamluk Sultans in particular. Hassan Nizami's Rajal Maasir, which deals with the reign of Aibak, and Barani's Tariq Firuz Sahi, which concerns itself exclusively with Indo-Muslim history. The rulers of the Delhi Sultanate, much like the Ghaznavis, appear to have been Persophiles, to coin a word on the lines of Anglophile and Francophile, like Persian, Persian and Parsi, Urdu and all, so Persophiles. Persian was the language of cultural power par excellence in this age, just as Sanskrit was in ancient India. Oh, by the way, let me stating the important fact that uh, who wrote Chhap Tilak, a very famous uh, song, blasphemous song, as you can say, or song to convert the infidels, or he raised the infidels and then to convert them, especially the Hindus. More continue. We seem to be now in a position to identify certain standards, semiotic resources, or cultural aspects of the Islamic state form, or its cultural power, or culture power formation, as it came to be in North India. This could be projecting sovereignty through monumental Islamic architecture and betterment of the public cultural displays or sacred spaces of non-Muslims using a discourse or imagery that harken Islam as a preferred cultural ideal to amplify, legitimate, and moralize royal authority. Preference of the Persian language was superior, especially with the spiritual potency of Sufis. The Delhi Sultanate rooted its power through the foregoing symbolic props and projected a cultural persona. Just as states in Europe and India historically acquired efficacious power and cultural persona through a fiction, moral, and visual rhetoric. Association with the Varna order, signs, dating, and the Sanskrit language. We think that the Islamic character of the Delhi Sultanate was a constant in the sense that it adopted the symbolic forms and practices identified above to project a particular cultural person, even if it had individual rulers who did not seem to have been very orthodox Muslims. For example, Sultan Balwan of the Mamluk dynasty, 1266 to 87, declared that since he could neither act as a defender of the faith in Panha, nor follow the religious commandments, Dildari, it was enough for him to dispense justice. Adl, while Muhammad bin Tughlaq, 1325, started peace being ruled by sultans who were not very observant Muslims. They could have made major concessions to the non-Muslims as well. Testifying to its unvarying Islamic cultural persona, the authors of this concession legitimated them within specifically Muslim notions of fairness and justice. So every time they made and concession came not from their mind changed or their philosophy or anything changed. The concession majorly came from a position of lethargy and like a position of like a sense of confirmation. That is clear here. There's nothing happening to us and all. Okay, but as the moment they they get this they get this into the state of lethargy or to go like this, the Sufis came and then the Sufis came and they matched the fire, they lit the fire, and then to turn it into a for general fire. In a way, a major catalyst. So they were performing a role of major catalyst for the to the Delhi Sultanate from the Islam that got 1500 years ago. For instance, when the well-established religious practices of the Hindus were guaranteed by the ulama of the Delhi Sultanate in the reign of Siddhar Lodi, 1489 to 1570, we know that it was done with reference to the Sharia. Okay, it was now the Mughal Empire as an Islamic state form. Power, 1526 to 1530. Founder of the Mughal Empire was not easy about making a belligerent show of his city. We learn from Satish Chandra, one of the most important historians of medieval India, that he declared the battle against Rana Sanga, fought at Khanwa, Rajasthan in 1527, to a jihad. Following the battle, he also raised a heap of the skulls of the enemy soldiers his army had slaughtered. Maybe he was making a grand display of the number of unbelievers he had dispatched. No doubt, like its predecessor, the Delhi Sultanate, the Mughal Empire, turned out to be an Islamic state form in every sense. This is noticeable to begin with in the way a Mughal ruler morally and validated his authority. For example, historians Sasi Joshi and Bhagwan Josh say that the dominant discourse legitimizing a Mughal ruler's political and economic position was one of Islam. This is true for the Mughal Empire reign under Akbar, 1556 to 1605. Wait, brother, do you respond to Twitter messages? This, wait. Yes, yes, just leaving away. We do respond to Twitter messages. You can comment. You can comment in YouTube also. We respond to YouTube, and you can either mail us in navavimas@gmail.com. Respond there also. Thank you. This is who for the Mughal Empire even under Akbar, 1556 to 1605. Apparently, the most culturally broad-minded and tolerant of Mughal rulers. Though a mature Akbar seemingly tried to make the non-Muslims genuine stakeholders in the empire by promoting the ideal of full amity among faiths. We shall argue that the Mughal Empire still very much remained an Islamic entity. According to Joshi and Josh, Akbar sought to go beyond the attempt to secure passive loyalty and reconciliation to achieve a new sense of accommodation, symbiosis, and participatory loyalty by addressing the balance of power between communities. Here, they write the cultural environment of the Mughal Empire remained suppressed with Islam. The Cambridge historian C.A. Bailey, C.A. Bailey, echoes his Indian counterparts when he speculates that what Akbar was perhaps trying to do was build a specifically Indian imperial patriotism in the context of the broader sovereignty of Islam. In popular consciousness, Akbar was the perfect foil for Aurangzeb, but both rulers, Joshi and Josh, argue enforced the hegemony of Islam. They employed different means. However, the basis of Akbar's cultural expansiveness, right, the two historians, was a conception of hegemony resting on an equilibrium of cultural norms, which acknowledged the cultural stamp of Islam on the Mughal state's political hegemony without threatening the cultural practices of non-Muslim peoples. In other words, they say the Mughal Empire projected a soft hegemony of Islam under Akbar. This is because we see that Akbar's approach was rather accommodative and gave cultural room non-Muslims. Aurangzeb, on the other hand, transformed the character of the Mughal Imperium and put it under a hegemony. Social Jaws maintained that Aurangzeb's paradigm of cultural hegemony was about implementing the ideological cultural nucleus of Islamic culture and the strong authority of ulama embodied which gives sanction and legitimacy to Mughal rule. Okay, by the way, let me mention here that Aurangzeb was tutored, trained by a Sufi from his very childhood. So he turned out to be a very hard follower of Islam. No surprise in that. Now let us now begin to delineate the Islamic portion of the Mughal state in some detail. To start with, it seems that sovereignty was framed and projected in the Mughal Empire with reference to Muslim history and convention. One notices, for example, that Delhi and Agra were designed respectively as Dar al Khalifa and Mustaqar al Khalifa. Mughal emperor was not infrequently called Khalifa, though Muzaffar Alam assured, though Muzaffar Alam assures us that the Mughal historian did not quite see the Mughal emperors as caliphs of Muslims. The very fact that they could be imagined in such a manner seems to suggest that in the eyes of the believers, their persons carried resonances relevant to them. We hazard this guess because we notice that the Mughal emperors prided in calling themselves the majesty and light of the faith. Jalaluddin Akbar, Jalaluddin Jahangir, and made periodic dispatch of rich donations to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. If the Mughal rulers were imagined as caliphs and their persons resonated with believers, it must have been because Islam often inspired or framed their actions serving as a paradigm of culturally desirable conduct or ideals from a peculiarly Muslim point of view. In 1568, after conquering Ithor, Akbar issued a proclamation reviling infidels. He also imposed the jizya on non-Muslims in 1575. Further, there is evidence in the Akbarnama and Aina Akbari of the forcible conversion of Hindus to Islam during Akbar's reign. In 1579, Akbar sought to assume the position of an interpreter in Islamic law and in spheres where the existing corpus was silent, of a legislator to the Maza. This was a statement or testimony signed by the theologians recognizing that Akbar had a particular religious status. Nevertheless, Akbar was not puritanical in the religious sense and did have an inclination Sufism, which probably accounted for a mystical experience he had had while on a hunt the previous year. But writes Athar Ali, this experience was altogether within the Islamic framework. This is why when we built a pavilion, laid a garden around it to commemorate it, we called the place Little Mecca, Makkah-e-Puhur. Akbar's enlightened religious outlook was Hikul, who seems to have evolved within an Islamic framework, as it had him employing the terminology of Sufi silsilas, and calling his spiritually followers Iradat Gabina or Murids. Very likely he was aspiring to a position analogous to a Muslim or spiritual guide of an elite set of disciples. In fact, SAA Rizvi finds that Akbar's mind was filled with religious orthodoxy, and his liberal measures merely tried divorcing personal beliefs from the public mood. Now, moving on to Jahangir, 1605 to 1527. He carried on in much of the same vein as his father. Among the achievements of his reign are listed the consolidation of the basis of the glorious community and enforcement of the precepts of the illustrious Sharia. When he invaded Mewar, he termed it a religious war. through various measures, Jahangir sought to portray himself as the protector of the true faith. To mention a few, he allegedly gave, according to the episode, he said, daily allowances to those converting to Islam, put an end to Hindu men marrying Muslim women at Rajod, and pardoned certain prisoners if they turned Muslim. His execution of Sikh Guru Arjan Dev is, of course, well known. Besides, he persecuted the Jains of Gujarat. No doubt, Jahangir was, for all intents and purposes, to majority of his subjects, a good Muslim. Like the Delhi Sultanate, the Mughal Empire curtailed the public cultural displays, the non-Muslim. Their signs or sacred spaces were thus frequently targeted for erasure. Jahangir had a temple of Varahara destroyed during a visit to Ajmer. Further, temples were destroyed at Kangra. Upon ascending to the throne, Shah Jahan asserted the fundamentally Islamic character of the Mughal state. He styled himself the protector of Islam and banned the construction of new temples. In his sixth regnal war, 1633, he ordered that no temple whose foundation had been laid in Jahangir's time but had not been completed would be allowed to complete it. Would be allowed to be completed. Shah Jahan, 1627 to 1658, also destroyed a fair number of temples, three in Gujarat, 72 in Banaras and its vicinity, and four elsewhere in the province of Allahabad. A few temples were pulled down in Kashmir too. His son Aurangzeb, 1658 to 1707, continued with the policy of not allowing the construction of new temples. At the same time, he destroyed several old sites. For example, he had the temple at Somnath demolished in 1665. The destruction of old signs became more frequent as Aurangzeb's reign grew embattled and he had to pacify uprisings by the Jats and the Marathas. He, it seemed, came to consider it to be legitimate to destroy even long-standing Hindu temples as a measure of punishment and as a warning. That is probably why he destroyed the Vishwanath and Keshav Rai temples at Banaras and Mathura respectively. When the Jat rebellion broke out, 1669, apparently Aurangzeb had begun to look upon the preservation of prominent temples as a kind of guarantee of good conduct on the part of the Hindus of a particular area. So whatever limited rights to cultural display the non-Muslims possessed in Aurangzeb's reign, it looks like they were contingent on their political rationality. Times it seems Aurangzeb demolished temples just to make a point. After he annexed the state of Jodhpur in 1679, upon the death of Maharaja Jaiswant Singh, many temples were demolished, thereby his emissary, Khan Jahan. This was, as it appears, an announcement that the state was no longer being governed by a Hindu Raja, but had now passed into imperial hands. And then, seemingly, Aurangzeb destroyed temples out of plain spite and whimsy, having once ordered the pulling down of temples in the friendly state of Jaipur. When on the way to the Deccan in 1681, he ordered the destruction of all temples in Hindu. Certain Hindu festivals were curbed too. For example, the celebration of Holi and Diwali were banned by an imperial decree in 1655. In 1672 to 73, Aurangzeb resumed all grants held by Hindus. The latter part of Aurangzeb's reign demonstrates the extent to which Islam as a paradigm of culturally culturally desirable conduct or ideals would be expedient for a Mughal ruler on account of the Islamic person of the state. In fact, if one studies his later measures keeping this factor in mind, Aurangzeb as a ruler begins to appear like a natural progression upon Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan. He authority writes that Aurangzeb took to emphasizing the Islamic character of the empire and inaugurated a new religious policy intended to create a religious halo around the imperial crown. When he was increasingly beleaguered, the reckless policy of expansion begun in 1659 had proved a complete failure, which, while there were many rebellions by Jats, Satnamis, Yesafazis, Pridis, etc., he adopted a discriminatory policy against the Hindus to associate the Muslim orthodoxy as closely as possible with the empire. That is why he imposed the jizya abolished by Akbar in his enlightened phase and began progressively cutting out the Rajputs from the nobility. This was so that he could have Jagir to offer to his Muslim nobility in order to rally them more firmly behind his throne. Satish Chandra, who avers that the reinstitution of the jizya and the Rajput wars ought to be seen as attempts by Aurangzeb to rally Muslim opinion behind him when he was facing reverses in the Deccan. So, if you guys know, just that Aurangzeb actually Aurangzeb wanted that the south, as you know today, like the Tamil Nadu and Kerala, Karnataka, etc., etc., from the Deccan, he wanted every part of it to be ruled under him, but he failed, and like, for that he was very frustrated and did all. And the more and more he was being frustrated by there, the more havoc he created in the North India by the way. Just so that his Muslim nobility and all, he can prove to his Muslim nobility and all that he is the Khalifa, the whatnot of Islam and anything. Okay. Now, however, he argues that Aurangzeb was not pursuing a preferably anti-Hindu policy since the number of Hindus in the Mughal nobility rose in the latter part of his reign. Superficially, this is true. Overall, the number of Hindus in the nobility did rise during his reign, but it was due to the influx of the Marathas. They had not been, yes, by the way, the Marathas were the reason why he was failing and conquering the Deccan to the south and all. They had not been recruited to the service on account of policy of religious tolerance, but had practically forced their way in. It appeared that the Mughal ruling class would be complicit with the Mughal emperor in culturally constraining the non-Muslims, despite being privy to relatively enlightened viewpoints. For example, the Mughal elites were familiar with the ideas of Khwaja Nasiruddin Tusi, the 13th century Persian polymath. In the Akhlaq-e-Nafiri, it takes that Tushio authored, the ideal ruler was imagined as one who would harmonize the conflicting interests of diverse social and religious groups in the state. Tushio inspired many later thinkers. Conscription of Muslim kingship remained the ideal in later Akhlaq texts. The intellectual tradition that Tushio inspired in emphasized the maintenance of balance in society and not the stamping out of infidelity and idolatry. The text composed in emulation of Hussein evaluated a ruler and his concern for justice in light of the reason of, and not any religious code. Okay, where are we? 64. Okay, okay. Usually, if not his emulators, had found widespread favor among those who ran the Mughal state. Muzaffar Alam informs us that Tusi's Akhlaq was among the most favored readings of the Mughal political elites, but were Tusi's ideas imbibed and put into practice as well. Well, not quite. Despite their familiarity with Tusi's Akhlaq, we learned the office bearers in the Mughal realm were not very broad-minded in religious matters. Muzaffar Alam acknowledges that it will be a travesty of the fact claim that they generally believed in and practiced religious thought. Like its predecessor, the Delhi Sultanate, the language that the Mughal state was partial to was Persian. In fact, one could term the Mughal state extravagantly Perso-Spanish. Though the Mughals were, though the Mughals were Chagatai Drop and Babur and Babur wrote his autobiography in Turkish. It was not Turkish but Persian, which came to symbolize Mughal triumph in India. In simple language, Persian was the language of power in the Mughal domains and was said to have emerged as the language of the king and the royal household and the high Mughal elite. The fact that Persian was associated with the conquerors who had preceded them might have been a reason why it was so valued by the Mughals. As we observe, Persian had originally come to flourish in Delhi and beyond in the wake of the Turkish conquest of North India. That is, upon the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate. Apparently, the cultural vision of this Persian on account of the Turks who spoke with was oriented towards the lands beyond India. This was since the Turks considered their Indian conquest parts of the Persian Islamic world in precisely the same way as Transoxiana, Transoxiana, Ghazana, Ghazna, and Ghu. Akbar, the greatest Mughal ruler, appears to have been similarly infatuated with the Persian Islamic world. He, for instance, took an unusual interest in promoting social, cultural, and intellectual contacts with Iran. As a result, Mughal India gravitated towards Iran culturally, and Persian poetry flowered under the sunny Indian skies. Aziz Ahmad calls the reign of Akbar the golden age of Persian poetry in India. In the meantime, many Iranian and Central Asian immigrants were drawn towards India. Among them, one could count princes, noblemen, and men of learning. These immigrants further diffused and lent strength to Indian Perso-Turkic culture. It seems that besides being its bearers, they also served as its benchmarks. For we are told that they caused the native born courtiers to develop an inferiority complex. These immigrants seem to have been looked upon as cultural archetypes of sorts and widely emulated due to them. The preferred high culture among Indian Muslims was Perso-Turkic. Okay. I mean, obviously, these guys are converted, product of conversion. So the actual ones look down upon them. We will further continue this on the next day part. We'll keep it to this only. It's a big chapter. Yeah, so it's a good right in understanding Indian culture, its interactions in Europe and India, and to Islamic like the state of Islamic State, the culture of Islamic State, the symbols of Islamic State, the Islamic way of symbolizing. So I hope you have enjoyed this. You have found it informational and for education. So please do like and subscribe and share to if you have liked it and to share it to others. And do comment it if you have any suggestion uh, in any suggestions like should we continue this? We will continue this anyway, but like what books should we read and what live stream do you need about any topic to discuss it or or video like that. So yeah, please do comment and let us know. Okay, up to this only. We'll continue the next thing. So before we sign off, I will once again remind you that this is from the book The Seedbed of Pakistan by Saumya Dey. He is an excellent scholar and independent researcher. So please do support him. The book doesn't cost too much. At least please buy it and read it and gift it to somebody you like. So yeah, we'll end it here today. Thanks, Sriram. Bande Mataram.